It's a great thing the Wheeler Centre has done in bringing to Melbourne such a distinguished group of speakers from abroad and also from other parts of Australia. And I'm really honoured to be part of that group of speakers and also to have been asked to curate the series. It wouldn't have been possible, as Michael has pointed out, were it not for the very generous grant given by the Meyer Foundation. And the Wheeler Centre and Meyer Foundation have really done Melbourne proud in offering these lectures and panel discussions free to the public. Well, I'm afraid this is a little bit long. You'll be astonished or perhaps alarmed to know that I've cut it down from 20,000 words. And to cut it further than I have would have made it far too dense. And I'm hoping that the discussion with the panel will clarify some of the more difficult bits of it. If tomorrow evening Stanley Hauerwas speaks the opening words of his very fine lecture as they're written in the draft that I've seen, he'll say, "I'm a Christian, I'm even a Christian theologian." I'm sorry, Stanley, to have stolen your opening words, but well, I'm not a Christian, I'm not religious, I'm not a person of faith, if to be that is to believe in God. I'm not a theologian or even a philosopher of religion. I say that I'm not religious because I don't believe in a Christian, Jewish or Islamic God. Were I to become religious, I suspect I'd become a Christian, not because I would have come to believe that this or that form of Christianity is the one true faith. In fact, I'm not sure what that phrase means, just as I'm not quite sure what it is to believe in God, what kind of believing, religious believing is. Stanley called one of his books Learning to Speak Christian. It's a beautiful and profound title, I think. Coming to any of the religions in which prayer plays a defining role is, I suspect, learning to speak that religion, learning to speak Judaism or learning to speak Islam. One can, of course, always learn to speak a new language, but mostly we're at home in our native tongue. We stumble, we're sinners. The religious writers who've affected me deeply are Augustine, Kierkegaard, and Simone Weil. But perhaps Bach has influenced me more than anybody else. However, I've loved and lived so long with my Israeli Jewish wife that my very Jewish stepdaughters, I'm very grateful to be able to say, now regard me as an honorary Jew. Conversion to Christianity is therefore unlikely, as unlikely actually as conversion to Judaism. Weil speaks to me because she writes with such hard-headed compassion for the afflicted. She says the compassion for the afflicted is a greater miracle than walking on water, healing the sick, or raising the dead. I think she means compassion that recognises the full humanity of the afflicted. Later I'll explain what that means. In Romulus, my father, I say of my father who went mad and tried to kill himself, Mitra, my mother's lover, who killed himself at the age of 27, my mother who also went mad and killed herself on the eve of her 30th birthday, and Vatsek, also mad, who lived near us on a hillside between two boulders. I say of them that I hoped I could tell the story of their suffering, showing them to have been broken by it, but not thereby diminished. Writing about such things, I listened every day to Bach to keep me truthful. So affliction is a large part of my theme this evening. I don't want to spend time looking at what the words religion and faith mean. There's a lot of learned discussion about this, but there's little agreement, so I don't feel obliged to defend one account or another or to offer my own. Someone responded angrily to the blurb for this series because he said it betrayed the common ignorant assumption that Buddhism is not a religion because it's not theistic. I replied that some people take Buddhism to show that you can be religious without believing in God. Others take the fact that Buddhists are not theists as a reason for saying Buddhism is not a religion. That's not a controversy I want to buy into. I should, however, explain why there are no Buddhist speakers in this series. Buddhism has few enemies in Melbourne, if any, or amongst most of the people who are now hostile to Islam, to Judaism and to Christianity, and of course who are hostile to Muslims and Jews, period. When it became clear to me that the focus of this series would be faith and politics, I decided to focus on the religions under attack. I said that I responded to Vay because she writes with such hard-headed compassion for those who suffer severe ineradicable affliction, especially when it's caused by or compounded by the brutality of other human beings. But she frightens me. Stanley Hauerwas has also written wonderfully about affliction. He frightens me too. Their intensity frightens me, though not at all in the way that the intensity of people who are usually called fundamentalists frightens me. Indeed, I invited Stanley partly because of the passion with which he speaks and lives his Christianity. I wanted you to have before you somebody whose authoritative witness to what he or she says and believes is undeniable. And in my letter of invitation to him, I quipped that I might subtitle the series Against Urbanity. I had in mind the kind of urbanity that condescends to intensity of all kinds, be it religious or ethical, an urbanity that would, as Richard Rorty recommends, make irony the default mode of response to life. Later, I'll try to explain why Simone Weil and Stanley frighten me. When Susan Neiman accepted my invitation to give one of the lectures in this series, I jokingly told her that I was glad because I was beginning to feel lonely amongst all the religious people I had invited. So I don't know what it is to believe in God, but I'm pretty sure of this. Anything that seriously calls itself Christian, Judaic, or Islamic faith must believe that it deepens rather than cheapens what human beings care for, whether they're religious or not, or whether they care a fig for religion. We may think they're wrong, of course, but they cannot say, look, I know this is sentimental, banal, tone-deaf to irony, riddled with cliché, disdainful of the world, but there it is, it's my religion. I'm not interested in aesthetics, I'm interested in truth. If I'm right about that, then we must find, in our thinking about religion, a space for a conception of the cognitive that enables us to understand what counts as depth and shallowness in the realm of religious thought, and indeed in ethical thought more generally. We need it if we're to make sense of the distinction between the God of religion and the God of the philosophers. And this is especially true of religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, because they're religions in which reflection on the examples of people's lives, deeds, and words deepens understanding of what is of religious significance, and indeed of what it is for something to be of religious significance. To illustrate what I mean, I'll comment on what's often called the problem of evil. For over 2,000 years, the reality of evil has been presented as though it were, for religious believers, essentially a problem about consistency between three propositions. God is omniscient, omnipotent and omniscient, God is good, his creation contains much evil. Primo Levi, who wrote with disciplined constraint about the worst evils known to humankind, said, if God exists, Auschwitz cannot. Auschwitz exists, therefore God does not. This has the form of an argument, but could anybody believe that Levi intended it as one? I mean, intended it as the kind of thing that invites us to examine its premises and the logical relations between them, taking the invitation to assume that both, that is, the premises and the logical relations, could be developed, made tighter, especially by people trained to do it, by philosophers or theologians, for example? Did Levi intend to give us for contemplation the kind of thing that would make it appropriate, perhaps intellectually mandatory under pain of being insufficiently serious, for him to subscribe to an academically A-listed journal of the philosophy of religion and to read, at least occasionally, some of the many articles on the problems of evil? Well, we know that some people came out of Auschwitz with their belief in God intact. Some claim that it was deepened. They thank God for the grace that enabled them to retain a sense of his goodness and to worship and praise him. despite what they'd seen and suffered. Others, more understandably to be sure, came up with their faith shattered. Some cursed God. Some thought that to do anything other than to curse him would be incoherent and even obscene, the kind of obscenity one finds, indeed, in the work of writers who, in a spirit of sweet reasonableness, assure us that God will, in his own good time, reveal to those who make it to heaven the providential role he assigned to Auschwitz. If someone were to ask me who's right, the people who retained their faith or the ones who renounced it, I wouldn't say that I don't know in a spirit that assumed that there is an answer to the question, but that I don't have it. Rather, I'd say that I don't know what right and wrong mean in this context. The distance between those who retained their faith in Auschwitz and those who lost it is both distorted and trivialized if one calls it the expression of a disagreement of a kind that could, in principle, be settled one way or the other by people with good and open minds. If that were possible, then we might indeed hope that that will be settled in an academic department, at a writers' festival, at a dinner party, or even here this very evening. It would be a mistake, and a presumptuous one, I think, to believe that only those who came out of the death camps with their faith shattered fully understood the horrors they'd suffered and witnessed. Presumptuous in the same way that some pacifists are presumptuous when they say that only they see the true horror of war. There is no non-Christian begging morally and religiously neutral account of what it is really to have understood the full significance of the horrors of Auschwitz that would necessarily convict those who retained their faith of being deficient in reason or sensibility, of a failure really to understand what they'd seen and suffered. Nor, I think, is there such an account of what it means to retain one's faith while in Auschwitz, one that, when it's fully and clearly elaborated, should convince those whose faith was destroyed that their vision of God had been occluded because their faith was too weak. Well, now to the distinction that I mentioned earlier between the God of the philosophers and the God of religion. The God of the philosophers is a metaphysical entity whose properties, if not his existence, are given to reason conceived as operating best when it's free of the disturbances of practical and effective human living. Propositions about him are, to the extent that is humanly possible, extracted from the natural languages in which they're expressed, languages that are historically deep and resonant with uncontrollable illusions, conditioned through and through by the living spoken human voice, so that they can be examined by metaphysically inclined philosophers and theologians in a kind of tone-free zone. The God of the philosophers is not a God whose very essence is such that we address him, that we speak or refuse to speak to him in all the tones and accents of the human voice, a voice conditioned by its vital responsiveness to the many facets of the human condition. The God of religion, on the other hand, is defined by the requirement that belief in him must deepen our ordinary human understanding of what matters in life. As I said before, nobody can seriously say it's cheap and sentimental, does the dirt on life, but it's my religion nonetheless. The God of religion knows our sins, our joys, and our woes, and all that's in our hearts. The omniscient God of the philosophers knows all that, and also our email addresses. Those who believe in the God of the philosophers are undeterred by the banality of that latter conception of what it means to say that God knows everything. Banality is not a concept that gets a grip on propositions in a tone-free zone. Nothing in that zone is sentimental, riddled with pathos, or tone-deaf to irony, not because thought there has reached perfection, but because such categories have no application there. It would be as inappropriate to say that the claims about the God of the philosophers, were they to achieve a tone-free status, are banal or sentimental or tone-deaf to irony, as it would be to say that of propositions in mathematics or in physics. The God who's cursed or praised is the God of religion, not merely because, as a matter of psychological fact, we take up such attitudes towards him, but because, I think, to have such and other attitudes towards him belongs to our understanding of his nature. With cold, unforgiving anger, Levi cast aside the God of religion. Perhaps he thought differently at the end of his life, I don't know. But if he did, I could not believe that he did so in the light of a conception of reason that informs most discussion of what is called the problem of evil. Reason, especially when it takes a capital R, is a word we should use cautiously. There's a case for saying that there's no such thing. Less provocatively, there's a case for saying it can only be the name for a capacity to think well or badly. But there's not only one way of thinking well or badly, because what it is to do it will be different according to what one's thinking about. It'll be defined by concepts, critical concepts I've called them, that tell us for this or that realm of thought and reflection what it is to think well or badly, and therefore, for that realm of thought and reflection, what it is to be legitimately persuaded to believe something. Why not, you may ask, call the forms of that capacity reason? My answer is that the word has acquired so much philosophical baggage, ethical as well as more narrowly intellectual, that its use can't be relatively innocent. Rather than speak of reason, therefore, I'd speak of the forms of legitimate and illegitimate persuasion, of the conceptions of what it is to try to see things as they are rather than as they appear, that partners those conceptions. Rational is also a seductive word, especially when it's contrasted with emotional as a term of criticism. Rationality is an indispensable intellectual virtue. I must emphasize that, in case I'm misunderstood as advocating a form of irrationalism. But it's a virtue only when one understands and respects the forms and limits of its application. When one tries to be lucid about one's mortality or our vulnerabilities and misfortune, for example, one must, of course, try to be rational. But one must also avoid sentimentality, a disposition to pathos, and so on, as forms of the false that in these kinds of cases constantly betray one's efforts to see things as they are. This richer conception of what lucidity requires marks the limits of the natural application of the concept of rationality. Sentiment, this is the slightly hard bit that I'll get over and then we might discuss it with the panel. But it's really important to my case, which is about public reason, and would be my answer to the edifying tones in which, just not so long ago in Melbourne, there was a meeting of what I call the New Atheists under the banner of the celebration of reason. The concept of reason, I think, that informed that is the one that I'm here being critical of. And so this is a bit that's pretty essential to what I'm saying. Well, sentimentality, to take just that as an example, sometimes functions as a cause of cognitive failure in much the same way as overheated anger or tiredness or drunkenness do. And in such cases, the cognitive nature of that failure, its character as something cognitive, can be specified independently of its causes, and indeed independently of the fact that we're vulnerable to such causes, independently of the fact that we are beings who can become angry, sentimental, tired, or drunk. Sometimes, however, when we criticize someone's thought or our own thought for being sentimental, our criticism identifies not a cause of cognitive failure, but a form of it. And when this is the case, it marks out a distinctive cognitive realm, a distinctive way in which we fail to see things as they are, a distinctive concept, indeed, of things being as they are. And in much of my philosophical work, I've tried to spell this out in some detail, but for the moment I'll just say that I've called that distinctive cognitive realm, where there is a distinctive form of understanding, I've called it the realm of meaning. And in the realm of meaning, form can't be separated from content, and feeling can't be separated from thought. It's there that we speak of the understanding that unites head and heart, and sometimes just of the understanding of the heart, meaning that it really is a form of understanding. And in the realm of meaning, it makes no sense to say, hey, I don't care whether some of the Beatitudes are sentimental. All that matters to me is whether they're morally true or false. Or to say, I know that this translation of Primo Levi makes him seem sentimental and often banal, but that doesn't matter. I'm interested in truth, not in literature. Almost everything that matters to us occurs in that realm. And this has implications that many people find unsettling, because it means that discursive thought that is answerable to the categories that define the realm of meaning is more radically in the midst of life than anything suggested by, for example, Wittgensteinian discussions of the way that concepts depend on our ways of living. Or to put the point another way, the significance of the fact, and I take it to be a fact, that what we think, of the fact that what we can think depends on what we can say, will be different according to whether one's thinking about metaphysics or whether one is, to take Stanley's phrase again, learning to speak Christian. But just that I'm not misunderstood, let me declare that I believe passionately that we must live our lives with our eyes open, that we owe it to the gift of our humanity. Socrates, as I'm sure you know, said that at his trial under sentence of death that an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being. If we take examination to mean philosophical examination of the kind that he undertook, then what he said is, of course, absurd and arrogant. But if we take it to mean that a life lived without a concern to be lucid about how one should live, as he put it, if we take it to mean that, then I think he's right. And his claim that such a life is not worthy of a human being can be taken to mean, as I suspect he meant it, that a life that does not acknowledge a requirement to lucidity is a life that does not honor the gift of our humanity, which is never something given once and for all, but something we are always called upon to rise to. Greg Denning, actually, in reviewing A Common Humanity, said that, he said for Gaita, humanity is not a noun, it's a verb. That's a good way of putting it. In Phaedo, Plato's Phaedo, Socrates is asked why he's opposed to suicide. And he replies, I quote, "The allegory which the mystics tell us, that we men are in the world as a soldier is at his guard post, and that one must not release oneself or run away, seems to me a high doctrine with difficult implications." End of quote. I think that Socrates saw his philosophical life in the same way, as a requirement to be faithful to a love of the world, sustained by a gratitude that was not conditional upon how things went for him. He saw suicide, he was thinking, I think, only of the kind of suicide that Kant characterized in his lecture on ethics as leaving the world as though it were a smoke-filled room, a kind of disdainful the world type. I think he saw it as both infidelity and gratitude. And I think he saw the life that did not struggle against illusion in much the same way. His passionate sense of an obligation to lucidity, which he expressed in that famous remark that an unexamined life is unworthy of a human being, was a form of fidelity and gratitude. It was fidelity to the love that revealed the world to him as his gift. Well, earlier I said that Bay frightened me, and so did Stanley Hauerwas. And to explain why I say this, because I imagine it strikes you as baffling, I want to comment on an encounter I had with a nun in a psychiatric hospital where I worked when I was 16 years old, in the early 1960s. I first wrote about her in A Common Humanity, and more recently in After Romulus. I was very hesitant to discuss her example again, but I've done so for two reasons. Firstly, because it's been so fundamental to what I think about these issues. And secondly, because it enables me to respond to Stanley Hauerwas's discussion of it, which I thought appropriate given that Stanley's speaking here tomorrow. For almost 3 months, I worked in a ward in which some of the patients had been hospitalized for as long as 30 years. Given the medications that were available at the time, all the patients in that ward were incurable. All were heavily medicated. None had visitors during the time I worked there. As I remember it, the ward occupied the entirety of a small Victorian building that looked to have been built for the kind of institutional purpose for which it was being used. It seemed even to express Victorian attitudes towards people who were severely mentally ill. Surrounded by white gravel and a high iron fence, it reminded me of some of the enclosures at Melbourne Zoo. And when patients soiled themselves, as some did often, they were taken to a shower block, ordered to undress, and to stand under the shower, sometimes still wearing their shirts. A member of the nursing staff washed them down the distance of a mop handle from them, as zookeepers wash down elephants. The shower routine was symptomatic of the brutish attitude of most of the nurses and psychiatrists towards those patients. We condemn it, as of course we should, but when we do, we should reflect, I think, on how very hard it is to see it as humiliating behaviour that shows no respect for people who have lost almost all visible signs of dignity. It seems as though there's nothing much to humiliate there. Many people believe that they would prefer to die rather than to be reduced to the condition of those patients. That's become evident in discussions of euthanasia. Even if we disagree with the thought implicit in that preference, namely that such a life is no longer worth living, most of us understand why someone might believe it. Many of the nurses and psychiatrists working in the ward probably thought that about the patients in their care, that their lives were not worth living. Of course, they could see that the patients were often upset by the way they were treated, but I doubt that they believed that any of the ways they were upset would really count as a humiliation. Those times were the times when people's ethical sense of what mattered in life was shaped by the hopes for self-realization of the beautiful people. And people who had that kind of hope for their lives, or those kinds of times, could hardly have been less congenial to a capacity of the nurses to see things differently. 4 or 5 psychiatrists in that hospital insisted that the patients be treated humanely. They worked devotedly to improve their conditions. Most were young, all were idealistic. I admired them for their compassion. I also admired them for their courage, because they are ridiculed by the nursing staff and sometimes by their colleagues as soft-headed fools who would allow themselves to be seduced by an idealistic illusion. Sometimes the scorn was fierce. At first, that astonished me, but later I reflected that it had the same quality that was expressed in the same tone as the accusation nigger lover or Jew lover, when it's directed against those who acknowledge the full humanity of a racially denigrated peoples. They found it as the nurses in the hospital found it as unintelligible that such patients should be accorded full respect, as racists find it unintelligible that faces that look to them like the black and white minstrel show caricature of an Afro-American face could express the full range and depth of human feeling. One of the psychiatrists said that the patients in the ward possessed an inalienable dignity. And he said this in the hearing of a nurse who looked at him with incredulous contempt. It was the first time I'd ever heard that expression. I was moved and inspired, but I confess I didn't know what he meant, except that the patients should not be treated brutally, and that I should never lose sight of the fact that they could be humiliated. One day a nun came into the ward, and in her middle years only her vivacity made an impression on me until she talked to the patients. Then everything in her demeanour towards them, the way she spoke to them, her facial expressions, and the inflections of her body, contrasted with and showed up the behaviour of those noble psychiatrists and me. She showed that they were, despite their best efforts, condescending, as I too had been. She thereby revealed that even such patients were, as a psychiatrist and I had sincerely and professed, the equals of those who wanted to help them, but she also revealed that in our hearts we didn't believe it. I wondered at her, but not at anything about her, except that a behaviour should have so wondrously this power of revelation. She showed up the psychiatrist, but if I were to ask how exactly, then I wouldn't elaborate on defects in their character or their imagination, or in what would normally be called their moral sensibilities. Of course, her behaviour didn't come from nowhere. Virtues of character, imagination and sensibility, given content and form by the disciplines of her vocation, were essential to her becoming the kind of person she was. But in another person, such virtues and the behaviour that expressed them would have been the focus of my admiring attention. I admired the psychiatrist, you'll recall, for their many virtues, for their wisdom, their compassion, their courage, their capacity for self-sacrificing hard work, and so on. In the nun's case, her behaviour was striking not for the virtue it expressed, or even for the good that it achieved, but for the power to reveal the full humanity of those whose affliction had made their humanity invisible. And love is the name we give to such behaviour. Recall that one of the psychiatrists spoke of the inalienable dignity of the patients. The dignity to which the expressions inalienable dignity and dignity, often with a big D, refer is not the dignity that people seek to retain when they ask to die with dignity, spare the humiliations that attend some illnesses. That dignity is alienable because it depends essentially on a person's demeanour in the face of suffering. The connection between dignity and a person's demeanour can, of course, carry over to situations in which a person no longer has a demeanour, when she's dead or in a coma, for example, and in which we're concerned that nothing should be done that would, in the ordinary circumstances of life, constitute a humiliation for them. Doctors and nurses will cover their genitals, for example. But if that's so, why has the concept of inalienable dignity, a concept that appears to have been designed specifically to enable its application to prescind from the demeanours associated with ordinary alienable dignity, why is it so appealing to us? Part of the answer, I think, is that because appeals to it are often invoked when a person has lost or is threatened with the loss of all visible dignity, it appears to keep that person in the same conceptual moral space as the concept that marks what he's lost. For this, it's important to note, is an expression in the key of the noble and the heroic. And for that reason, it's easy to see why it's often deployed in struggles against oppression, especially oppression which is premised on, as racial oppression is, on disdain, sometimes contempt for the oppressed. It's also easy to see why it's such a well-suited partner for the idea of inalienable rights, for that too is a concept in the key of the heroic. And for that reason, people often speak of dignity that's inherent in every human being, or of inalienable dignity, to which we owe not esteem but respect that is unconditional. And that's why those words and phrases occur so often in preambles to international law, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. When I was a student, it was the expression inalienable dignity as it was used by one of the psychiatrists that impressed me. But it's striking, I now realise, that I did not use it to characterise what I took the nun's behaviour to have revealed, muddled though my efforts were in this respect. In the preface to A Common Humanity, I say that the nun's behaviour gave living meaning to words I'd heard often, but which I'd thought could never refer to anything real. Goodness, of a kind that invites a capital G, love, beauty, purity. Instinctively, but not at all clearly, when I wrote about the nun then, I realised that to say that the nun had revealed their inalienable dignity was to speak in the wrong key. To oversimplify it a little, it would have been made her seem like a Kantian heroine, a doer of such astonishingly supererogatory deeds that even the psychiatrists seemed like mere foot soldiers in service to her noble cause. The mainstream of the philosophical tradition brings saints and heroes together, interchangeably for the most part, under the concept of a supererogatory act. But the saintly behaviour of the nun should be characterised in the light of a conception of morality that has goodness rather than one of the heroic virtues as its focal concept. And my point I want to emphasise is not that a conception of value that has goodness rather than, say, nobility as its focus is unable to appreciate the heroic. Rather, it's that within that conception, what we make of the heroic, the noble, the honourable, the value of autonomy and so on, is transformed for us in the light that saintly deeds have cast on what it means to be a human being. And the point can be generalised to all the virtues. One's understanding of compassion and charity and so on will be different according to whether it's been informed by the kind of goodness shown in saintly love or whether it hasn't. And so too will our understanding of the affirmation that radical evildoers must remain fully our fellow human beings, and also of the golden rule that one should always treat others as one would wish them to treat oneself, which many people take to be the basic precept of morality and to capture the essence of the biblical command to love one's neighbour. Well, at this point, you may be impatient to press on me a question. Why don't I acknowledge the obvious, that the nuns behaved as she did because she had supernatural beliefs about the status of the patients? She believed they were sacred, that they were all God's children. Perhaps you would even offer abstract accounts about what such beliefs came to metaphysically. It's certainly the case, I freely admit, that many philosophical commentators on my work, especially those who've read the account of the nun, believe that my work is implicitly religious. But in its most common form, the thought that I'd been avoiding the obvious when I discussed explanations of her behaviour without mentioning she had religious beliefs about the patients, in its most common form, it assumes that the ascription to her of religious beliefs diminishes, even if it does not entirely extinguish, any tendency to think that her behaviour was wondrous for what it revealed. Ascription of religious belief to her is intended to render her behaviour fully explicable, even to someone who doesn't share religious beliefs, because false beliefs, after all, can explain a person's behaviour equally as well as true ones. The rhetorical point of the question is to suggest that if there is something wondrous about her behaviour, it's that she was able to do what many people, in fact, believe the same as she did, just can't do. The focus then is on her and her virtues, just as I focused on the psychiatrists and their virtues. And on this account, if her behaviour was indeed wondrous, then it's because she did superlatively what the psychiatrist did only quite well. But that's untrue to my experience at the time, experience to which I'm bound in a kind of testimony. For me, her behaviour was not wondrous in the way a feat or performance or moral or psychological capacity to do something could be wondrous. When I came to reflect on what I'd seen that day, that struck me as one of its most important features. I've been trying to outline the conceptual space that reveals those features without distortion. And it's true that if I were religious, I'd say that only grace enables one to see people like the patients in the hospital as they appeared in the light of the nun's behaviour. But not being religious, I've sought secular ways of expressing this without diminishing the wonder of it. Furthermore, I'd say attribution to her of explicitly religious beliefs will not diminish the mystery of what she reveals. To say that she saw those patients as God's children does not diminish the mystery that we should have developed a concept of the sacred, of what it is to be a child of God, that includes the idea that we should respond to people who are severely and ineradicably afflicted, whom, as we put it, have lost their minds and lost everything and won't recover it, that we should respond to them without a trace of condescension. Were I, therefore, in the light of her example, to try to answer the question, from where did we ever get even so much as the idea that it's intelligible to respond as the nun did, then I would say that it emerged in the history of saintly behaviour of the kind the nun showed towards the radically afflicted, and that historically the accumulative effect of that behaviour generated a language of love, in whose light any particular instance of it can appear to us as wondrous and call us to a kind of witness. Had it not been for the language of saintly love nourished by the works of saints, we would not, I think, have a sense of what her love revealed, and it would not have had the power to reveal it. Much of that language is, of course, religious or infused by a religious spirit, but what grows in one place may take root in another. Expressions such as inalienable dignity or talk of the unconditional respect that's owed to all persons sometimes gains power because they resonate against the language of love, rather than because they point, as the very great philosopher Immanuel Kant, to whom we owe them, would insist, towards a philosophical elaboration in terms of the respect owed to rational agency. A passage in Simone Weil's wonderful essay, Human Personality, provides an example of what I mean when I speak of the language of love. She asks, I quote, "What is it that is sacred in every human being?" She enumerates and rejects a number of facts about us. The list is not exhaustive, but its rhetorical point is that no list could provide a rational underpinning for our sense of what it means to wrong somebody, especially when that wrong is a fundamental violation of them. She writes, I quote, "At the bottom of the heart of every human being, from earliest infancy until the tomb, there is something that goes on indomitably, expecting in the teeth of all experiences of crimes committed, suffered and witnessed, that good and not evil will be done to them. It's this above all that is sacred in every human being. Every time there arises from the depths of a human heart the childish cry, which even Christ could not restrain, 'Why am I being hurt?' then there is certainly injustice. Many people do not hear it, because it's a silent cry which sounds in the secret heart." End of quotation. I don't know of a finer, more hard-headed and more morally truthful way of expressing the wrong done to the people in that hospital when they were forced under a shower to be mopped down of their feces. She writes to explain what it is that is sacred in every human being, but the moral work is done without reference to the sacred or without essential reference to any religious concepts. A religious person, of course, might say that's exactly as it should be, and that might be true, but that would be a much longer discussion. In the preface to the second edition of Good and Evil, I discuss a question that was put to me by Stanley Hauerwas. Hauerwas responded to the question, and I'll quote him at length. This is all quotation now. It's nearly 1,000 words of quotation, but it's standing at his best. Gaita acknowledges that religious traditions have spoken most simply and deeply about such a view by declaring all human beings sacred. But he contends that the language of love, nourished by the love of saints, can stand independently of speculation about supernatural entities. What grew in one place can flourish elsewhere, he says. I certainly have no reason to suggest that Gaita's account of goodness as a non-condescending love is unintelligible if God does not exist. But then the question has never been about God's existence, but ours. Gaita is quite right to think that if Mother Teresa and the nun he encountered at 16 did not exist, we quite literally would be less than human. They did exist, however, and it at least makes sense to ask if and how they and the goodness they revealed make sense if the God they worship does not exist. That may well be far too an abstract way to put the question. For the God they worship is not some abstraction, but rather a reality known through participation in a community across time and space. This is the important part. What I suspect Gaita misses, no, it's not the only important part, but this is an important. What I suspect Gaita misses is the role that friendship plays in the lives of people like the nun he so admires. In particular, the nun Gaita admired and Mother Teresa were not afraid to be befriended by those they served. To suggest why friendship is so important for the development of such concepts, I want to introduce another life that exhibits the kind of love Gaita thinks so defining of goodness. The name of that life is Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier is the founder of the movement known as L'Arche, in which people who are called mentally handicapped live with those who are not. L'Arche's home is first and foremost just that, a home. The core members of the home are the mentally handicapped. Those who are not mentally handicapped are called assistants. Assistants do not live in the home to care for the mentally handicapped, rather they are there to learn to be with the core members in the hope that they can learn to be their friends. Gaita suggests that the wonder that the nun should elicit in us is not to be directed at her, but rather is the wonder that a human life could be as her love reveals it. Jean Vanier would not wish that we wonder or react with awe in response to his life. Any wonder would rightly be in response to the humanity revealed through those who have befriended him. He and his friends reveal our humanity, a goodness that we should not have known possible without their showing. Jesus did not answer the young man's question concerning what deed he must do to inherit eternal life. Instead, he commanded him to sell his possessions, give the money to the poor, and follow him. To learn to follow Jesus is the training necessary to become a human being. To be a human being is not a natural condition, but requires training. The kind of training required, moreover, has everything to do with death. To follow Jesus is to go with him to Jerusalem, where he will be crucified. To learn to live without protection is to learn to live without possessions. To be dispossessed, however, cannot be willed. To try to be dispossessed is to be possessed by the will to be dispossessed. Rather, as John Vanier's life reveals, to be dispossessed comes by being made a friend of those who have no possessions. They have had to learn to live without possessions. John Vanier had to learn from them how to live without the protection we think possessions provide. But I'll leave the discussion of the significance of that to the panel. But I might just say very quickly, I should have realised after writing Romulus, my father, that he was absolutely right, because my father also could respond to Wozzeck, who was quite mad, without a trace of condescension, and befriended Wozzeck. I should have realised that. Well, the fact that we can all agree that people who suffer severe and degrading treatment should be treated as fully our equals without condescension, or that evildoers are owed unconditional respect, different from esteem, that fact is a wondrous cultural achievement. So, at any rate, it looks to someone like me who's not religious, and therefore must look upon these affirmations as of human origin. But that most of us can agree on this more or less as a matter of course, and usually forgetfully of how wondrous it is itself a sublime achievement of our cultural history. But it's hard to know with clarity the deepest reasons why we're committed to what matters most to us ethically and spiritually. And that's true of individuals and also of cultures. And given the historical importance of religion in shaping our sensibility, consciously and unconsciously, even if only through art, that's not surprising. To become lucid about this, we need, if only implicitly, an understanding of how we assess when we're legitimately moved by art that appears to have a content to which we may not honestly be able to assent. So our sense of what it is for something to be offered as a reason in much of what we say about ethical, religious and political matters is, I think, conditioned by the concepts that define what I call the realm of meaning, which means that we should acknowledge that discussion of these matters is inescapably in the midst of things. It's there that we argue about what counts as love, including love of one's neighbour or love of God. It's there that we argue about what it means to wrong somebody and what kind of compassion might be shown to the afflicted. It's there that we argue about how we should respond morally and legally to people who have done the most terrible, morally terrible things and who are totally lacking in remorse. It's there that we discuss what it means for someone to be tortured, or what's so distinctively terrible about genocide, or what it means for a woman to be raped in war, such that we should call that rape a crime against humanity. It's there, indeed, that we discuss what it is morally for something to be a crime against humanity, or indeed what it is for something to be a crime, period. And there we discuss what it is for something to count genuinely as love of country rather than jingoism, of what it means morally to be shamed for the deeds of one's country that one loves, and so on. In all sorts of ways, our discussion of these matters is attuned, sometimes well, sometimes badly, to the resonance's illusion of the natural languages in which we conduct those discussions. And as we all know, parts of that language can sometimes die on us. There are ways of speaking that have only have developed an insecure place in our life with language. Well, nowadays we often speak of discussion in politics as a form of conversation. And conversation in what one might call the loaded sense of the term is rare. And by the loaded sense of the term, I'm thinking of when someone, for example, explains joyously that they have at last, as they put it, at last found somebody to talk to. And when we speak of real conversation, distinguishing it from many other forms of discourse, from the exchange of pleasantries or talk directed to a particular end, a business contract or a seminar, for example. Where such conversations are, most forms of human interchange can turn into conversation. And in all conversation, one can unexpectedly find oneself answerable to what I've called a call to seriousness. That's a burden inseparable from the joy of having found someone really to talk to. But even when the call to seriousness is just an exasperated, for God's sake, think for it, it's always to a particular individual, unique and irreplaceable. And it calls her to an individuating responsiveness, that is, to speak out of what she's made and should continuously be making of experiences that are her history and that make her who she is. The call is at one and the same time that she speak disinterestedly, in the sense that implies that she should try to overcome the many temptations of what Iris Murdoch called the fat, relentless ego, and that she should speak personally, that she should speak in or recover or even for the first time find the voice that reveals her distinctive take on the world, a voice that reveals, as Kierkegaard put it, that she's really lived her own life and no one else's. Inevitably, calls to seriousness are sometimes severe. Why should we be joyful that at last we have someone really to talk to, unless we trusted that person to be severe with us when necessary? It would, of course, be foolish to believe that the kind of answerability to another person's calls to seriousness and the kind of individuality that's required to rise to it could fully be realized in the relations between politicians and citizens, or between citizens themselves, no matter how well things go on talkback radio or Q&A. Real conversation, as I remarked earlier, is rare and difficult in most circumstances. And were it not so, we wouldn't be so struck by the exclamation, "At last, someone to talk to." Nonetheless, when the notion of conversation is used explicitly or implicitly in the practice of politics, we, politicians and citizens, are reminded that citizens are individuals, answerable to one another, answerable to politicians, and that politicians are, in turn, answerable to them. It's not, I think, fanciful to say that a politician explicitly on talkback radio, but perhaps also implicitly in the manner of her speech on television, can enter into a relationship with citizens where she does become answerable to the challenge. Are you serious? Do you expect me to believe that? Do you take me for a fool? And so on. Bringing democratic politics under the constraints of conversation is a way of dramatizing the ideal of a democracy as a form of government in which politicians must argue their cause and legitimately persuade the electorate, answerable to it, not as to a mass, but as to individuals whose need of truth they must not betray. But as I've suggested, really to converse, one must speak with a particular voice. Or to adapt a marvellous line from Isaac Bashevis Singer, one must speak from an address. And that's also true of the voice of faith. Faith is not the isolated achievement of individuals, whatever one says about its personal nature. It always emerges in a particular culture and is mediated by a particular natural language. One cannot learn that language alone or only with others of the same faith. The language of faith mixes in all sorts of ways with the language with which we speak of other things, about almost every other thing indeed. It's therefore naturally talkative. If the idea of reason abstracted from what has moved us to operate in a tone-free zone is a myth, or at any rate a conception that cannot engage with our ethical concerns, so too is the idea that the deliverances of faith derive from communication directly between God and a particular individual. The God of religion speaks to people in, for example, English or French or Arabic or Hebrew. And that was the significance of my remarks earlier about the difference between the God of the philosophers and the God of religion. It's foolish to think that for the purposes of democratic politics, God should speak in Esperanto. Calls to seriousness can be severe, as I said. We must take seriously what is an offence to people of faith in our community, though as everyone knows, that's a delicate matter, especially as criticism can justifiably be severe and therefore hurt. Often it will depend on the spirit in which criticism is made, and that requires judgment of a kind educated in what is to be seriously responsive to the categories that define the realm of meaning. It won't help to be tone deaf, for example. To ban satire about any important matter would be a serious blow to free speech, but it takes a good ear for tone to know when satire merely, if I might put it this way, causes pain, and when, on the other hand, it's deeply offensive to the person whose beliefs have been satirized. For a non-religious person, the object of respect must be, of course, the person rather than God. But to respect the person, must be sufficiently inward with their belief to know how to strike the right critical note. And sadly, this is not true of much contemporary hostility to religion. And being inward with the beliefs of religious people will make a difference between hurting your opponent and justifiably inflaming their anger. It will determine the difference between a hurtful call to seriousness, which keeps conversation open, and something that is the betrayal of conversation and then closes it. The demand that conversation remain open is intrinsic to what I have called a call to seriousness. And those who have read Romulus, my father, will know that I learnt much of this from my father. And I'll close with a quotation from Romulus. And this is a quote. In one sense of the term, my father was a fierce moralist, not about the big and controversial issues of the day, but about simple moral requirements such as honesty and a concern for one's neighbour. If he thought you were a liar or a cheat, or had acted unkindly, then he would say so to you without a trace of euphemism. But there was never anything in his judgment that implied you should be shunned by decent people. Though fierce and uncompromising, his judgments were not what we now call judgmental. Even his most severe judgments were made in many tones. If he called you an incorrigible liar or a crook, he might do it angrily, scathingly, sorrowfully, or, strange as it might sound, matter-of-factly, but never in a tone that suggested he would turn his back on you. You are always welcome at his table to eat, and more importantly, to talk, always to talk. But he believed that it was essential to decent conversation that no one pretend to virtues one did not possess, as essential as being truthful about one's identity. Only then could conversation be true to its humane potentialities and do its humanizing work of opening up the possibilities of authentic human disclosure. Thank you. Sorry it was so long.